The Swedish air tree in War Thunder just got the Finnish MiG-21bis. Let's check it out. First things first, I do have a review up of the MiG-21bis in the Soviet tech tree, from about a year ago. But here, we're going to be focusing on the MiG-21 flying for Finland in the Swedish tech tree in the current meta late in 2022. Now, during the Cold War, Finland was in a pretty unique situation geopolitically, and it tried to straddle a pretty difficult neutrality policy, which led to a diverse collection of military equipment imported from both Western and Eastern Bloc sources. Among these were its acquisition of the MiG-21F in the early 1960s, which were state-of-the-art at the time and made Finland a very early adopter of the type. By the late 1970s, the 21F was starting to show its age, and it was lagging pretty far behind current performance standards. And in 1978, Finland started replacing them with the MiG-21bis. This was a heavily upgraded model, with all-weather capability, a new radar, a new weapon system, greatly improved flight performance, and importantly, more fuel. These gave Finland not only an all-weather interception capability, but compatibility with semi-active radar homing missiles, which is something they were eager to introduce. Finland continued to expand its fleet of MiG-21bis interceptors all the way into the 1980s, and they formed the core of its interceptor force until the late 90s, when they were eventually retired and replaced by the F-18. Finland also converted some of their earlier MiG-21bises into the MGBT reconnaissance standard, which was based on the bis but added an active jammer and additional fuel. What we get in War Thunder is the Finnish MiG-21bis, which is honestly almost a copy-paste of the Soviet and German versions. This jet sits in rank 7 of the Swedish air tree at a battle rating of 11.0. The plane has the Sapphire 21 radar set, which is a relatively basic radar compared with most other jets in rank 7. It supports boresight targeting, but it lacks any other advanced features. The plane also gets a ballistics computer for its unguided rockets and for its cannon. The weapon loadouts allow for a variety of air-to-air missiles, along with unguided rocket pods, to be mounted on 4 different underwing hardpoints, including an option for double R-60s mounted on the outboard pylons, and the plane gets custom loadouts enabled by default. Now, its air-to-air missiles start off with both versions of the basic R3 missile, the infrared homing R3S and the semi-active radar R3R. These are very basic weapons with kind of poor performance for rank 7, but the R3R is the only all-aspect missile this plane can take. The R13M1 is a semi-active radar missile with fairly good performance. It has 20 Gs of pull, respectable range, a good warhead, and it's surprisingly resistant to flares. However, it can't slave to a radar lock. Now, the plane also gets the basic rear aspect version of the R60. This is a close-in dogfight missile, best used under 2 kilometers. It's got 30 Gs of pull, and it can slave to a radar lock, but it loves to chase flares, and it's got a kind of small warhead. Now, I tend to go with a loadout of 1 R3R and 1 R13M1 on the inboard pylons, and 4 R60s on the outboard. The flight performance of the Finnish MiG-21bis remains amazing, just like its Soviet and German counterparts. The acceleration is outstanding, it climbs very well, and it's incredibly fast with a very good maximum speed, even at low levels. The agility is highly competitive, even with 2 years of power creep. This jet has a very strong turn rate at medium or high speeds, and its overall performance is still excellent in vertical maneuvers. Being a delta-wing jet, it's got a tendency to bleed off speed in sustained high-G, tight rate turns, but if you mix up your maneuvers a little, it's possible to keep this plane near the better parts of its flight envelope for a pretty long time. When you do need to slow down, the air brake is very effective. Just remember that, like most MiG-21s, the turn performance on this one goes to shit at lower speeds, and if you get around like 350 kilometers an hour or slower, it's just going to be hanging in the air, waiting to stall out. Now the good news is that its engine performance really delivers, and with its strong afterburner, you can, as I mentioned a moment ago, keep it in a good part of the power curve. But fuel. As with the entire MiG-21 family, the engine on this thing is thirsty for fuel. And even with a full tank, you can run out on enduring confrontation maps, and you still gotta pay attention to it on the smaller maps. Managing your fuel level is honestly more of an art form than a science, and it'll just come with practice. Now, the last thing to mention is that the plane still suffers from some minor structural weakness if your wings are loaded with missiles and you're out pulling sustained high-G turns at high speeds. Even with the boosters unequipped, I ripped the wings on this one a couple of times in sustained maneuvers. Not enough that I consider it a big problem, but enough that I'm mentioning it as a caveat with the plane. Taking the Finnish MiG-21bis into air battles in the current meta means that you're squaring off against 4th generation fighters. On paper, this plane is completely outmatched by stuff like the F-14, Mirage 2000, or even the MiG-21 MLD. You have to contend with pulse Doppler radar sets and BVR missile shots. Honestly, as long as you can survive the BVR spam in the opening stages of a match, you'll be okay, but you have to plan your attack runs very carefully. The R3R is your only all-aspect weapon, and it's not a good one. So if you end up in a head-on with something like an F4J, a Mirage F1, or an F14, it might be a short mission. What I try to do is fly around the wide edge of a match and wait for a furball to develop. Then come in low at maximum speed and jump right into the thickest fighting I can find. This plane is still an excellent close-in dogfighter, so if you can keep the fight under 3 kilometers or so, you're at least on even footing with the majority of jets in the game right now. And if it's flown well, you can remain highly competitive with the 4th generation fighters that are slowly trickling into the top tiers. Now, in terms of ground attack, this version of the MiG-21bis has fewer options than its Soviet and German counterparts. The others can take dumb bombs and a variety of unguided rockets, but the Finnish plane can only take some S-5K rocket pods. It gets the ballistics computer, so it's technically possible to use this jet as close air support with the rockets, but that's not what it's for, and really its potential there is pretty limited. Even in air battles, I'm going to give the same advice I did for the Soviet MiG-21bis. Skip the ground-pounding portion of the grind when you're spading this plane up from stock, and just get started with air combat right away. This thing is a close-in dogfighter, plain and simple, so get close and start swinging for teeth. Visually, I'm a big fan of this plane. Not just because I think the MiG-21bis is a pretty cool-looking jet, but I've always been fond of Finland's sort of a green flat paint job for it. In fact, one of the scale models I have in my collection is actually a Finnish MiG-21bis. So I was pretty excited when I saw this was getting added into the game. Great looking plane. Landing is basically the same as other MiG-21s. This thing lands fast, and it needs to in order to avoid an approach stall. It can drop its landing gear and flaps safely at around 430 kilometers an hour, and since it's got both a good air brake and a drag chute, it really shouldn't be a big problem to land this thing, assuming you can touch down safely and you don't stall out. The cockpit is pretty standard MiG-21 stuff. The radar scope's in an inconvenient location, and it doesn't have a visible radar warning receiver. Rearward visibility is poor, forward visibility is iffy, and side visibility is acceptable. Overall, mediocre cockpit. to close out on the Finnish MiG-21bis for Sweden. This plane has engine power to spare, an adequate supply of capable air-to-air missiles, and a ballistics computer if you want to attack ground targets for some reason. Also, it's got a level of dogfight agility that's still competitive in the top-tier meta as of the end of 2022. However, it runs out of gas really quick. It only carries a medium quantity of countermeasures. Its low-speed maneuvering is pretty crappy, and its radar just isn't competitive at top tier. The final verdict on the MiG-21bis in the Swedish tech tree is that this is still an amazing close-in dogfighter, and it gives players a compelling reason to research the Finnish subtree within the Swedish tech tree. Get this thing in a close combat, and it won't let you down. As always, thanks for watching.